right, thanks everyone for joining another episode of Money Over IP, the MOIP show. I have with me George Gammon, who many of you know as a YouTuber, both as someone who shares his knowledge and helps others learn how to get to financial freedom, financial independence. So definitely very excited to compare notes with George, and hopefully he'll share some of his wisdom with all of us. George, thanks for coming to the MOIP show.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'll do my best to share some, I don't know if I'd call it wisdom, but maybe some thoughts.
Yeah, so give us a little bit of background on your upbringing. I think you changed kind of, you had like a moment in which you decided, okay, I'm just going to do something completely different. When was it? Why did you decide to do other stuff? And
I have that moment probably once every other week. Oh, well, I was just what's probably most relevant is I was a very poor student. I almost flunked out of high school. And then I got into the real world. I had many jobs. I started working when I was 15 years old, grew up very poor. And then I started a few businesses. The first few failed, of course. And then I started consulting and doing a few other things. And I had some businesses that actually panned out. I just kept trying and trying and trying. And then I was, I guess, relatively successful. I was a self-made millionaire at 34 or so. And then I retired at 38 in 2012. And when I retired, I didn't know anything about investing. I mean, I didn't know what a yield curve was. I really didn't know what the Federal Reserve was. I knew nothing about real estate. I'd never owned a piece of real estate, didn't know anything about precious metals, commodities, nothing. So, but what I did know is in order to not have to go back to work, I needed to make about a 5, maybe 6, 7% return, so I could live off of the investments or off of my savings, and I wouldn't have to draw down my savings. That was kind of my initial objective. And again, this was 2012, the summer. And so I was in Singapore, actually, and I had about 10 minutes to blow before a dinner date. And I was on YouTube, ironically enough, and I stumbled across Milton Friedman's Free to Choose series. And I didn't know who this Milton Friedman guy was, but I started listening to it, and it just immediately resonated. He just beautifully articulated all of the ideas that I had in my head bouncing around, not only from a standpoint of being an entrepreneur, but maybe even more importantly, from a standpoint of being an employee. And I've been on both sides, which I think is a huge edge for someone to truly understand the benefits of free market capitalism. But that kind of took me down the rabbit hole. And from there, I started listening to Thomas Sowell, Hayek, just all these old YouTube videos. And then I started to really get into the investors themselves. So guys like Jim Rogers, Mark Faber, Jim Grant, Jim Rickards, Peter Schiff, Rick Rule, Doug Casey. I just absorbed as much content as I possibly could, whether it was YouTube videos or podcasts or anything that I could listen to. And I really related most, I think, to Jim Rogers. I think first and foremost, because he reminded me of my father, who was very old when I was born. And he lived to the ripe old age of 92, had a fantastic life, but he passed away in 2005, and I was extraordinarily close to my father. And I mean, to this day, he's still my hero. I'm sure many people out there can relate. But Jim Rogers, his mannerisms, the way he speaks, just his style, it really reminded me of my father. So that was the first reason why I really enjoyed listening to Jim. But also what he was saying just really made sense to me. And I've always been a contrarian, and I know everyone says that, but I'm so much so that even growing up, if all of my friends or everyone in school was doing, wearing this style of clothing as an example, I would feel very uncomfortable if I did the same thing. I would always want to do something completely opposite I just could not stand doing the same thing that everyone else is doing. It really bothered me. And so when Jim was talking about investing in places like North Korea, or now Venezuela or Turkey or Zimbabwe or Tanzania, something like that, I really, it got my attention, because I'm like, I like that, because everyone would tell you that you're crazy for doing that. And that's where I like to be. So anyway, I started trying to figure out what I could buy at the time that was cheap. I just figured, well, you just buy low, sell high, like Jim Rogers. And at the time, I looked at charts of housing in the United States going back to 1900. There was this chart I was using that was adjusted for inflation. And you could see that prices, when you adjust for size and inflation, really didn't change from 1900 to 2000. So for pretty much 100 years, the prices didn't go up, contrary to popular belief. They went up in nominal terms, but they didn't go up adjusted for inflation. So then, of course, in the early 2000s, we all know what happened. If you look at that chart, it goes parabolic straight up to 2006. And then it comes down and it bottoms out in 2012. So I knew prices, and oddly enough, when it bottomed out, or when it was making its bottom, which I didn't know it was a bottom at the time. I mean, everyone was telling me I was insane to even think about real estate in 2012. They said, don't you know real estate's the worst investment you can possibly make? We had this huge crash. It was a bubble. It's going to go down forever. Don't touch real estate with a 10-foot pole. That's what everyone was saying back then. It's easy in retrospect to look back and say it was brilliant, but back then you had to have some big balls to go in there and pull the trigger like that on an asset that was completely unloved, to say the least. But anyway, it bottomed out on its historic trend line there. So at the time I got in, I studied Japan as well when they had their big bust in 90. And I saw that their market went down by about 60%. So we at the time were down by maybe 50% or so. So I figured there was still at least maybe 10 or 15%, maybe even 20% downside. But I started looking at the cash flows, and I'm like, okay, well, yes, real estate can go down by another 20%, let's say, to be conservative. But I mean, the cash flows are staggering that you're getting right now.
Right, you could generate real yield by investing in properties today, right? I mean, today, if you want to buy a piece of real estate, you probably can't even get 4 or 5%, right?
Yeah, that's not adjusted for inflation, right?
Right.
So yeah, back then you could get some massive yields. So I thought, well, the cash flow is cheap. This makes a lot of sense. Let's go in and dive in. So I started buying houses at the tax foreclosure auction in Kansas City, Missouri, on the Missouri side. Then I started to just really enjoy that process. And I learned it. I understood it. It made sense. I had a huge edge from being an entrepreneur, because as an entrepreneur, you learn how to manage people and solve problems. And that's the main thing you have to do in real estate when you're buying these crappy looking houses and improving them, and either flipping them or keeping them in a rental portfolio, which I did. So in 2014 or so, I started to expand. I wanted to go overseas, because as an entrepreneur, I made a lot more money overseas, oddly enough, than I did in the United States. So it's kind of a natural progression. And 2015, by now I've started to study macro. So now I know what a yield curve is. Now I know what the Fed is. Now I kind of have a little basic understanding. And at the time, oil dipped down below $30 a barrel. And I knew that adjusted for inflation, that was cheap. So I wanted to go long oil, but I didn't know anything about oil. So I said, well, this Colombian peso is loosely tied to oil because it's a big part of their GDP. So maybe I could buy something that's denominated in pesos, and that's kind of like going long oil. And I said, well, I don't know anything about currency markets, but I do know about real estate. So why don't I go in and start buying peso denominated real estate, and maybe I can work my magic, the same stuff I did in the United States. And then you get a double whammy. So you have the forced equity or the appreciation on the remodel, and then maybe you get a pop on the currency because of oil, and then wham, bam, thank you, ma'am. Hopefully we'll see what happens. So I started investing heavily in 2015 in Medellin, Colombia. And oddly enough, the currency, I haven't made much money on that, but I have made a lot of money on the real estate, and we've become I've got a team there now that does it for me
Yeah,
full time.
Colombia is one of the best performing economies in South America now. I mean, they've been doing very well. So good pick. Definitely, definitely a great pick. When you
Yeah,
look at
yeah.
us, the Fed and the government basically printing money, spending money we don't have. And what's your views on basically on both like domestic real estate, on other asset classes, bonds, stocks, crypto? What's your views on where investors or savers should be hiding?
Well, it's a difficult question because you're in the everything bubble, and it's
Yeah.
stocks and bonds. I mean, you look at the S&P 500. See, the thing though with the S&P 500, it's a little misleading because it's so concentrated in just maybe 7 or 8 companies. So there could, if you're a real good stock picker, like I'd say Lynn Alden would fall into that category. You might be able to find some value out there, but the problem with that is that if the S&P goes down, if we have a crash from this overvalued level, it's going to be like 2008 or 9 with real estate, in the sense that you could have a great house in a great location. All the micro economic factors could be at your back as far as those tailwinds. But if you have this massive crash,
Yeah.
it's going to bring all the boats in the harbor down with the tide. And so if you look at the S&P 500, you look at the market cap, the Buffett ratio as an example, or the CAPE ratio, it's extremely high levels. And if we go back to Jim Rogers, you want to buy things when they're cheap and sell them when they're expensive. There's absolutely nothing about the S&P 500 right now that's cheap. Ditto that for bonds. I mean, you're looking at interest rates at, let's call them 4,000 to 5,000 year lows. And if you got the interest rates at 4,000 year lows, that means that prices are at 4,000 year highs.
Right.
So nothing cheap.
It's like picking a penny in front of a steamroller, the buying bonds these days. I mean, most people are so used to like that 40-60 allocation of their portfolio that when I stress, okay, you should not own almost any bonds right now, they look at me like, what are you talking about? I've had bonds for 30 years. Well, this is a different special situation, right? So it's not a normal situation where we're going through right now.
Yeah, but I would say the 60-40 portfolio isn't even normal.
Right.
See, the problem with that is they just use charts starting at 1980. And they say, oh, look at how amazing the 60-40, the risk parity portfolios work. Well, yeah, when you've had interest rates going from 18% straight down to 0, sure,
Right.
it's worked great. What happens when interest rates go from 0 back up to 18%? That risk parity portfolio might not do well. Anyone that falls victim to the kind of the sales pitch from financial advisors, I would strongly encourage them to read Chris Cole's paper, The Allegory of the Hawk and Serpent, where he goes back over the past 100 years and analyzes all of these different strategies, whether it's buy the dip, risk parity, and then he compares them over time, each decade, how they would have done. And you see that prior to 1980, let's call it 1920 to 1980, that 60-40 split would have performed horribly. It would not have done well at all. I was just listening to a video from Milton Friedman, just trying to get my head straight because the world's so crazy right now. So whenever the world gets this crazy and it seems like you don't know what up from down, I always try to review history and try to listen to the greats that preceded us and their wisdom, and try to layer over what they're saying on top of what's happening today, just to have a more clarity. Right. But Milton Friedman was pointing out to this person who was interviewing him about freedom of speech. He was making a point about freedom of speech. This person said, well, the United States is the greatest country on earth because we have freedom of speech. And Friedman pointed out, he said, well, I agree with you. The United States is a lot better than other countries, but we by no means have freedom of speech here. We may have it in the Constitution, but in practice, we do not have freedom of speech. He said, let me give you an example. He said, you read the Wall Street Journal. And you know, at the time, this was probably the 60s or 70s when he was talking. And he said, you read all these newspapers and you see all the advertisements from all the big banks, the Goldman Sachs, the JP Morgans, that you should be buying bonds, buy treasury bonds, buy bonds. And he said, but if you look at the data throughout the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, bonds were the worst investment or the worst asset class you could possibly be in. So he said during this time frame, he would call some of his buddies that ran the Goldman Sachs and the JP Morgans, and he would say, hey, are you buying bonds? And the CEO would say, absolutely not. No,
I'm just selling them.
Don't you know that's the worst investment you could be in? He says, well, then why are you taking out all these full page ads in the Wall Street Journal and telling all of your clients to buy bonds and treasuries? He said, Milton Friedman said, every time the CEO would say, because we don't want to piss off the people at the Treasury.
Yeah. And the last few auctions, almost no one showed up.
Well, the Fed shows up.
You know, like I know the Fed shows up, but I'm saying now you always talk about Japan and how we're probably gonna end up like Japan, and we're there already. I mean, in Japan, I think the BOJ is the largest buyer, almost the only buyer of locally denominated bonds. So it's definitely this experiment. You know, like modern monetary theory is neither modern and neither a theory. I mean, it's like you know, like it has a beautiful name, but really reaching out to the future and spending money, our kids' money, spending money we don't have to make sure that we can keep our lifestyle, we can survive through bad times, is definitely, you know, I grew up poor like you, and that's not how my parents taught me, right? I mean, life has great moments and has moments that you have to basically get through, right? And here, again and again, we're bailing ourselves out by reflating our economy, and each time we're printing an order of magnitude more dollars to do that, right? I mean, if you look at the 1987, right? We did that in 87. We did that in 91. We did that again in 2000, 2008. And now we're talking about, again, what is going to end up being tens of trillions of dollars. So when you look at you know, obviously there's a lot of noise today. Coinbase going public, right? It's worth anywhere between 80 and 100 billion dollars. What's your view on basically this Austrian economic thinking of limited supply, assets that are not denominated in fiat currencies? What's your view, and what would be the allocation? Like if you had to recommend to somebody, you know, how they should treat their assets today, what would be your asset allocation?
Well, I just suggest doing the same thing that I do for myself, just because I try to keep it simple. And I use this portfolio setup that I call 10-80-10. So just 10% insurance, 80% investments, which I consider, or I define as something that pays you to own them, and then 10% to speculative assets. And speculative, it doesn't mean that's not a negative connotation. It just means that they're not paying you to own them. And so I would put Bitcoin in the speculative asset class, meaning it might not pay you to own it, but it's got some incredible asymmetry. And I would put uranium in that category. I would put the gold miners in that category. As far as the insurance side of the portfolio, for me, that's just physical gold, just because I'm not trying to get rich off that. I don't even care if it goes up in price, just so long as it maintains its value or it maintains its purchasing power.
In case there's real disaster, right? Like in case everything just breaks down, you need
it's a good cash hedge. So you always have some cash on the sidelines, and you know, you always worry about the cash going down in value. If it does, most likely the gold will go up slightly and just kind of act as a counterbalance there. But the main thing is with the 80% of the portfolio, it's just paying me to own it. So I can get it wrong. I don't have to get it right. I don't have to know what the price direction is going to be. What I did in 2012 was a perfect example of that. I didn't know if home prices were going to go up or down. Who knows? In fact, I thought they'd probably continue to go down, but I didn't care because the cash flow that I was receiving from that asset was so staggeringly high that if I kept it for the next 40 years, I don't care what the price is doing in the interim. Right. I'm not selling.
It paid for itself several times over. But for people that need to make decisions today, you're lucky. Again, you bought a portfolio right when the real estate was bottoming. You invested in it, right? You created a lot of income properties that kind of continue to pay. And again, as you pay off your debt or mortgages or whatever, it's all free cash flow. So people that have to make these decisions today, they can't, right? I mean, everything, like you said, it's an everything bubble. Real estate, even though Corona is obviously hurting the economy, is at all-time highs. I mean, you can't get, like, you go to Florida and you try to buy something, unless you are going to overbid by 10 or 20%, you're not going to, no one even going to talk to you. So, what people, young people that have to make decisions today, right? They don't have that much to invest. Do you still recommend for them to buy income properties, or what would be in that 80% that is supposed to pay yield? Where do you go for yield these days?
You have to go overseas for yield to buy things when they're cheap. And so then it becomes a question of, I'm assuming most of your viewers, their expenses are denominated in dollars.
So, about half, yeah. Half are Europeans, half are Americans. So
okay. You know. So you have to be cognizant of that, because if you've got whatever currency your expenses are denominated in, you can't have a portfolio that's 100% other currencies, because then you're taking quite a bit of risk if it goes the wrong way. So for young people, or just the kind of the average Joe, I think that you've got to own some precious metals. I think it's extremely wise to own some Bitcoin. And then with the other part of your portfolio, you've got to look around and get outside of maybe the European Union or maybe the United States, because there are things out there that have very good value, that are cheap and are going to do well if you believe the future for the global economy, for that matter, is going to be inflation because of all the money printing, if you want to use that term, from the central banks, or the fiscal deficit spending that's being monetized or will need to be monetized by the central banks. So another thing too, that just the average ordinary person, maybe not in Europe, but definitely in the United States, can do, is they can make sure that if they have a mortgage, whether it's on a rental property or their own, where they live, to make sure that it's a 30-year fixed rate mortgage. Make sure you've got that, because what most people don't realize is that's a hedge against the dollar. Now that's actually a short position against the dollar. And
the bank is taking the risk on the devaluation of the money, not you, because you have the property, they have the debt, and hopefully, again, the dollar does lose its value, but your home increases in value, and you coming,
or your cash flows. Let's just assume that your cash flows go up with the rate of inflation. So, I mean, let's take an extreme example. So you buy an asset or property right now for $100,000. Let's just assume that it's paying you $1,000 a month in rent. And let's just assume your mortgage payment's $500. Well, your mortgage payment is going to be $500 for the next 30 years. But is your rent, the rent income, going to be $1,000? Absolutely not, especially if we get significant amounts of inflation. So let's say that we get 1970s type of inflation over the next decade. At the end of 10 years, you could be charging, who knows, $10,000 a month for rent, maybe $15,000. And that sounds astronomical, but just remember, it wouldn't have any more purchasing power than the $1,000 you're getting right now. But your mortgage payment would still be $500 a month. So that would be obviously a much larger delta, not just in nominal terms, but in real terms as well. So that's a transfer of purchasing power from the bank or the lender to the borrower. And that's why, in my mind, it is true that real estate is in a bubble right now in the United States. There's no getting around that. There may be pockets of opportunity if you're an expert to find a motivated seller, if you really know what you're doing. But we live in such strange times that the way I'm looking at real estate in the United States, as I'm looking at it as though the property is actually the liability on your balance sheet, and the 30-year fixed rate mortgage is the asset. You see, back in insane times, obviously the property would be the asset, and you would expect that to go up in value, or you would expect to make the money on the asset, and you'd expect to lose money on the debt because of the interest you're paying, because you're paying back more than you borrow, right? But now I think it's the opposite, in the sense that you may lose money on the property because the prices are at nosebleed levels, but you may make even more than you lose on the debt because you're paying it back with those cheaper dollars. So, and I'm not saying everyone go out and do that, but that's kind of an interesting way that I'm thinking through the real estate equation right now in the United States. But the bottom line is, for the average person, my goodness, own some precious metals, own a little Bitcoin, something with asymmetry there. I like some of the commodities as well, but then make sure that if you do have a mortgage, it's a 30-year fixed rate.
Right. So I wanted to ask you, because you're very vocal about your thoughts and views on everything that's happening with central banks and the Fed and obviously Treasury. And it sounds almost like I agree with a lot of your views, and it sounds like no one is listening to us, right? I mean, the party is going on, the music keeps going, and everybody looks at us and say, "Oh, you guys, you don't understand anything. You know, this is what it is now. This is the reality. You know, like you guys live in the past. You listen to Milton Friedman, you listen to all these people who don't, you know, what do they know? You know, so what's your view on what is a trigger? Like what basically event brings reality back and stops the music? Obviously, right now, the Fed has done a phenomenal job putting a safety net under the U.S. economy, right? Basically reflating the markets, being the Fed put, right? And guaranteeing that everybody who invests in stocks or bonds or whatever is not going to lose their money. And right now, there's no moral hazard, right? Everybody thinks that trees can go to the sky. There's no gravity. So what event triggers the pendulum to start swinging in the other direction?
Well, I don't know that they've done a good job in micromanaging the economy. I would say they maybe have done a good job in instituting a Fed put and creating massive asset bubbles and distortions in the financial economy and completely destroying the price signals and the price mechanism and price discovery. And they have kicked the can down the road, but in my opinion, they've made the underlying problem and the real economy far, far worse. And I think, you know, I just did a video yesterday and it was on this topic. Most people see wealth as money, or better stated, currency units. So if you have more currency units in your account, your bank account, which by the way is just an IOU for IOUs, but most people—
IOUs from insolvent institutions.
Well, IOUs for IOUs, because they owe you dollars, which are IOUs. So anyway, but most people think that if that little number goes up, then they are wealthier, and therefore, if everyone in society's number goes up, then we are wealthier as a society. I don't know how we've gotten into this mode. I don't think it's purposely being brainwashed by the central planners and the teachers in our school system, but they did it unintentionally, and they did a very good job. The wealth of our society is not measured by how many currency units we have in our bank account. It's only measured by the amount of goods and services we create efficiently. Period. It's productivity. If you are stranded on a desert island and all you had was a big chest full of $1 billion, or gold for that matter, or Bitcoin,
Right.
you'd still be dirt poor.
Right.
Because you don't have any goods or services, right?
There's
So
no economy, right.
that's got to come first. So when you're asking yourself the question if the Fed has done a good job, you've got to ask yourself, well, do we have more goods and services now than we did back in, 2010, 2008? And the answer is no. You can't even get an Uber anymore. You can't get a reservation at a restaurant. I know that's not in totally the Fed, but that's a result of the central planners, meaning the government, doing all these lockdowns, reducing the supply of goods and services. And oh, by the way, paying people to stay home and not go to work. So you're giving people an income while at the same time they're not producing anything, right?
Right,
And
and also you're funding zombie companies that are, if we were going through a normal economic recovery, those companies will be basically recycled or replaced with productive
that's
assets,
correct.
productive. Where today, again, we bailed out the airlines, we bailed out the cruise companies, anyone can raise as much debt as they want. So again, the safety net collected both the good and the bad, and we're not investing in the future. I mean, you're talking about trillions of dollars
Right.
of being spent on the past instead of being spent on the future.
Yeah, and well, let's go back to your original question, because I kind of went off on a tangent there. I apologize. And so what would be the trigger to kind of bring down the house of cards? I think you've got to look at inflation. And ironically, that's what the Fed is trying to produce. And I've always said they're trying to produce their own kryptonite. It's like Superman trying to say,
Right,
we need
they raised the
kryptonite
target
for you.
to 2 to 4%, right, from 0 to 2.
Oh, who knows? It's just constantly changing goalpost. And my good friend Lynn Alden pointed out, she said, how many economies do you know that have completely collapsed due to hyperinflation? And you sit there and say, well, you got Venezuela, you got Zimbabwe, you got Germany, you've got Hungary, you've got all these other places. She says, okay, good. How many economies do you know that have completely collapsed due to deflation? You got the Jeopardy music going in the background. You can't think of any. The worst thing that you can think of is the United States during the 1930s, and that was far from a collapse. And the next thing that you can think of is maybe Japan. And you're telling me that Japan is on par with Venezuela? Not even close. But the irony here is that's what the Fed's trying to do. They're creating this boogeyman of deflation that we should all fear. And then they're saying how great inflation is, that, oh my gosh, it's amazing. If we could just get inflation, our economy would be booming. But if you really think about what they're saying if you lose 2% of your purchasing power every single year, the economy is going to boom.
Right.
How does that make any sense at all?
Inflation is good for them. It's not good for you. I always say the Federal Reserve is neither federal nor has any reserves. And their job is really to create, again, they're owned by banks, right? So they do what's in the best interest of the banking system, which is low inflation. Low inflation is not, like you said, deflation is good for you and for me, because the money we have, you go to sleep, you wake up in the morning, it's worth more, and you didn't have to do anything, right? Yeah. And that's really, it kind of brings us to Bitcoin, Ethereum, and so on, because these are all deflationary assets.
To a certain degree.
Partially because people lose their keys, and partially because there's such a mass of new adoption of more people joining, which is creating much more demand than there is supply, right? The inflation of Bitcoin is something like 2.6%, the creation of new Bitcoin, where the growth in the usage of Bitcoin is high double digits. So we have example of very well working deflationary assets that are acting in your best interest. And people are starting to learn that this inflation boogeyman that people are selling you, telling you, oh, we need a little bit of inflation, like you say, is really not true. You're not seeing that mass migration to deflationary assets, right? You're not seeing that anywhere in the world.
I don't know about no, probably not a mass migration, but I don't see, that's a very interesting topic of discussion as far as a cryptocurrency or Bitcoin being a deflationary money. I think it depends. And I've said for quite a while now that, um, perfect money controlled by imperfect human beings in an imperfect world will most likely behave imperfectly. And what I mean by that is yes, you've got a limited supply of Bitcoin, most likely decreasing to your point because people lose their laptop or they lose them. And but if you really think through, okay, if Bitcoin is being used as a reserve asset, one in 10 years, in 20 years, is it going to be lent out on a full reserve basis? Or are we going to go back to fractional reserve banking, in which case you're not increasing base money, but you're increasing broad money, right? Even if Bitcoin was all the currency that we used from a transactional standpoint, and therefore, in essence, you're kind of doing the same thing. And most people get confused here. They think that the government was responsible for fractional reserve banking, or that somehow came about due to the Federal Reserve. It's not true. Back in the early 1800s, we had, in the United States, we had free banking. So it doesn't mean that your checking account didn't have any fees. What that meant was it was free of the government and free of central planners and central banks. So, but during that time, we did have fractional reserve banking. It was something that was brought on by the free market. But I would also add that during that time, during fractional reserve banking, we had 50% deflation from 1800 to 1900. Why? Why can the banks increase the money supply that way, or the currency supply, and at the same time we have deflation? Because because we didn't have any government involved or central banks, they lent to productive purposes. So if they created new money supply, it was to produce more goods and services more efficiently. So you have the amount of goods and services expanding faster than the supply of currency, although we still had fractional reserve. So you see my point there is, if we did use Bitcoin, I don't know if the free market would say, okay, we know what happens. We know why fiat is bad. We saw what happened in the United States or what preceded us. Therefore, we're never, ever, ever going to lend Bitcoin out on a fractional reserve basis. It's going to be full reserve only. I don't know, maybe for the first few years, depending on how bad the fiat collapse is and how ingrained and how gun shy people are about creating additional money supply. But I think over the next decade or the next 20 years, eventually people will say, you know what, let's go ahead. We want a little bit of an extra return and we need some fluidity in the money supply. Let's go ahead and just go back to the fractional reserve for Bitcoin, using that as a reserve asset, just like we did gold in the early 1800s.
Bretton Woods in 1971, we were attached to the dollar. Everything was backed by real gold. And then Nixon took us off that, and the party started, right? The experiment, the dollar, the fiat, the dollar as a free floating experiment started in 1971. You know, a lot of people say, oh, this Bitcoin thing, it's new. We haven't had it for a long time. Well, guess what? Fiat as a dollar as a fiat currency is also an experiment. It's a very recent experiment. So I agree with you. I think we went through these cycles. We experimented with different systems. Through some of them, we thrived. And today, we are, everybody else is printing too. So I think the Fed is not on, if the United States was the only one printing and the Bank of England or ECB or Japan was not, then we would be in a ton of trouble. But because everybody else is printing, some of them are even printing faster than us, in relative terms, we're not yet seeing the inflation, right? But so just going back to my original question, the why don't we see inflation? I mean, we should see signs of prices going up. We should see signs of all of this money, helicopter money that's been sent on us, push prices up. We're still not seeing that.
I am. I don't know where you live, but here in the United States, or I've been in Arizona for the last few months, and now I'm in Florida. But if you look at the cost of anything, I mean, I remember, I forgot whose podcast I was listening to the other day, but they were talking about used car sales and doing a comparison 2019, 2020, 2021. And since 2019, the price of used cars has gone up by like 20 or 30%. And I've noticed it because I've been shopping for a used car, and I'm a car guy, and I've been in that business or in one way or the other for a while. So I see all these cars that I used to buy, or I used to look at obsessively to try to figure out the prices to flip cars, maybe just as I did it as kind of a hobby. But I mean, the prices have just gone through the roof. I was just at Barrett Jackson the other day, and the prices of stuff just staggering. I could not believe what the prices of those cars were going for. You go to your local restaurant, you go to Chipotle, I can promise you prices are higher now than they were in 2019. Almost anything. There are a few things that
CPI just doesn't capture any of that, right? But in the real
CPI
world,
doesn't capture that. It doesn't capture home prices because they do a rent adjusted equivalent. So they don't capture a lot of these things. So I would argue that although the CPI, what the Fed tells you or what the government tells you, may be at 1.7%. If you look at your personal expenditures, your personal inflation rate is probably closer to 8 or 10%. And it makes sense. Another thing too, that if you look at the amount of, we'll call it, I hate to say the money printing, because the Fed doesn't really, they just create bank reserves.
great debt. Yeah.
Yeah, that's usually the job of the commercial banking system, is to create more,
right,
we'll call it currency supply. But now the government, through the monetization of the debt, is actually creating more money supply as well. But the United States is doing that at a much, much faster pace than the other developed countries. So if you look at the broad money, base money of like Japan, as an example, over the past couple of years, or the the European Union, or the ECB, or the Fed, the Fed and our M2 money supply, our broad money, has gone up much, much faster.
Yep.
Than
26% of all the money in history in the United States, at least, has been created in the last 2 years. 76% of all the dollars in existence created since 2008. So definitely, I'm making your point. So
yeah, they're really, so it's not, see, going back to 2008 when we started QE1 and then what is now QE Infinity, they were creating bank reserves, and although base money was going up, broad money really wasn't going up at that fast of a rate. That's why we didn't see massive hyperinflation when the Fed took their balance sheet from 800 billion up to 4.5 trillion. But now we're starting to see the Fed's balance sheet go up and broad money go up at the same time. That means the amount of currency units that are out there chasing goods and services increasing. And from what I have seen, the amount of goods and services has gone down dramatically. When you look at all the lockdowns and everything the government did in response to COVID, then you see all the supply chain disruption. You see all the narrative for jobs coming back to the United States and manufacturing. You see the $15 an hour narrative being pushed. And then you see the car companies, they can't even make cars because there's a chip shortage. There are all these shortages that you see. I went into Smith's the other day, which is a grocery store in Arizona. It's a grocery, I don't know where else it is, but it's right there in Arizona. And I was just looking for a toothbrush, for heaven's sakes. And usually you're accustomed to going into a grocery store and seeing the toothpaste and
options. Yeah.
just stock. You just pick whatever one you want. It was like barren. There's like, you could only have like choices of like 2 different toothbrushes.
It was like Russia before, exactly. It's like shortages.
Yeah, all these shortages. So, and it makes sense. Why is it that the last place I was in Arizona was in Tucson, and I was there actually doing the car stuff in a few years earlier. No matter where I was in Tucson, I could be way out in Dove Mountain, which is the middle of nowhere, And it would never take me more than 5 minutes to get an Uber. Never. And I was there this past time, and you're lucky if you can get an Uber in 45 minutes. Here, a true story, in fact, that your viewers might enjoy. I'll give you some insider information. So I was going to Puerto Rico, and I was there and then came back, but I needed to get a COVID test to go there. So Puerto Rico, you have to have it within 72 hours, but then you don't get your results for 24 to 48 hours. So there's this very short window where you actually have to take the test. So I had it set up on a Sunday. I couldn't get an Uber from my hotel. I just could not get one. So I missed my appointment. I had to reschedule it for the next Monday, or for the next day, Monday morning. And then I had to get it because that was the very end of the window. And I scheduled it at 10 o'clock. At 11 o'clock, I had an interview with Mark Faber, probably someone that you know well. And
Gloom, the king of doom and gloom, yeah.
That's right. And your viewers know well. And he's one of my favorites. So I had a hard deadline at 11 o'clock. So I tried, it's like starting at, like 8:45, I started trying to get an Uber. Even if I got there 45 minutes early, I knew at least I'd get one, right? And this CVS where I had the appointment was like 3.5 miles away, something like that. Can't get an Uber, can't get an Uber, can't get an Uber. And it got to the point where I had to make a decision. Either I sit here and roll the dice on an Uber and potentially miss my appointment, or jog to the CVS. So I said, F it. I'm just going to jog. I'm not going to risk it. So I jogged all the way to the CVS. And then to get back in time for the Mark Faber interview, I had to jog right back as fast as I possibly could. I got down to that interview. I'm just dripping in sweat. I'm like panting and sitting there trying to talk to Mark Faber and actually interview him and be coherent. That's my point. That is a shortage of goods and services. Why? Uber drivers aren't working because they're getting paid to stay home. Yeah. Why would you go to work? Look at I just did a study yesterday from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So this isn't some libertarian crank, website or think tank or something like that, or some Austrian website. This is right from the government. And they say that incomes in the United States in 2020 compared to 2019 went up by 6.1%. How is that possible when we have unemployment levels that spiked up higher than the worst unemployment levels we saw during the Great Recession in 2008, 2009? So just do the math. People have 6% more income. And by the way, their expenses have been cut by 33%. Because they don't have to pay rent,
right?
And they don't have to pay their mortgage,
forbearance, everything else,
yeah. So then you have the unemployment level. So just do the math. It's very obvious that we have more currency.
Socialism, right? We're basically reinventing socialism in the United States.
Yeah, I'm calling it welfarism because a lot of people say, "Oh, we don't have socialism here because the government doesn't own the means of production," and that's fair. That's very fair using actual definitions. And by that definition, Sweden is by no means socialist, but they practice what I consider welfarism. And I want to point out that a lot of people would say, "Well, I'm a democratic socialist. I believe in a big welfare state." Well, that's fine. But you need to go back and read The Road to Serfdom by Hayek. It's a book that I've been studying a lot lately. And you'll see that Hayek pointed out that there is a difference between socialism and welfarism. He combines the terms, but he says now it's kind of a different definition. But he says that both still put you on the road to serfdom. It's just a matter of timing. If the government does own the means of production, then you're going to get there a lot faster. But if you have this big welfare state, you're still on the road, but you just might get there a little bit slower.
You're given the wrong incentives, that's for sure.
That's correct.
I wanted to ask you about this. There's a mass migration to Texas and to Florida. And really, I think our entire kind of both economic and political map of the United States is shifting like never before. These are mass migration, hundreds of thousands of people leaving and going to live in a different place, partially because of taxes, partially because of lifestyle choices and so on. do you see that again? Do you see that as a temporary thing, or do you feel that these are like irreversible trends?
No, I don't think that's temporary. I think that's something that we'll see for the next decade. Because, and why do I say that? Because taxes are going up. Taxes, I mean, there are no certainties, there are only probabilities. But I think the probability of taxes in the United States going up is extraordinarily high. And you've got these high tax states like Illinois, like New Jersey, like California, New York. And at a certain point in time, people are just like, no, I'm not going to give over 50% of what I own to the government. You know, Peter Schiff had a great point the other day. He said that even in medieval times, the serf would give the lord 25% of everything. I'd be happy as an American if I only had to give the government 25%. Right. That would be fantastic. So yeah, I think you're going to continue to see that migration. I like Florida a lot better than Texas. And it's not that the state itself, I love Texas. I think it's great. My sister lives in Dallas. But I'm just concerned with Texas over the next 10 years because that's where all the people from California that voted the way they did to screw up the whole entire state, and they're voting the exact same way in Texas. So, right. I mean, is Texas going to be California in 10 years? That's what my question would be. But you come to Florida, and I don't think there's very many people from California moving here. And I don't want to demonize all the people from California, but you guys get what I'm saying. But here in Florida, I'm on the West Coast right now because when I was in Puerto Rico, I was appalled at what they're doing there. I mean, it's a complete police state. They've got curfews. They've got, I mean, it's like East Germany. They're just building the bricks of the Berlin Wall around the people that live on the island, and they just can't see it. But hopefully that will go the other direction. But anyway, I just don't want to deal with that right now. So I said, screw it. I'm not going to be in Puerto Rico where I was supposed to be for the next few months. I'm going to go back to Florida. So I went online and tried to figure out which county had the least amount of restrictions and which county had gotten rid of their mask mandate for the longest period of time. And I saw that Sarasota County was good, and they got rid of the mask mandate back in, I believe it was January or so. So I came to Sarasota, and then I went down to Naples on the advice of my sister. And I can tell you that right here in this area, it's very sane. It's very similar to life that you would have had in 2019, and especially in North Naples. I mean, there people, you go into a grocery store, you go into a gas station, you can't find someone that's wearing a mask. And I'm not saying that you shouldn't wear one. What I am saying is that you should have the choice. You should have the choice. It should be up to the individual whether or not they want to take a perceived risk or what they want to do with their body. If they want to lock themselves in the house, fine, do it. If you want to shut down your business, great. That's your business. But you should have the right. And that's what I am seeing on the West Coast of Florida, which in this crazy world where it's very easy to be pessimistic, if you're someone who values liberty and freedom and you live like somewhere like Puerto Rico or California or somewhere else that has these draconian measures, it's easy to kind of get down and get a little depressed and say, my gosh, what direction are we going here? But you come to Florida, you see that, it gives you new hope for and new optimism if you're someone that really values that personal freedom and liberty.
Right. No, I hear you. So next 3 to 5 years, if you project yourself into the future, I mean, are we just chugging along sideways? Do we have a massive correction here in the markets and so on? Or do you feel that again, as long as the Fed and the government continues to do what they're doing, we're not going to have any major disruptions?
Well, I think as far as the real economy, I compartmentalize that question into the real economy and the financial economy. So the real economy, I think you're going to see something similar to the 1970s, maybe not that extreme, but you're going to have structurally high unemployment, and you're going to have higher consumer price inflation. The stuff that you buy on a daily basis, those prices most likely, again, there's no certainties, most likely going up. Now, asset prices, a very difficult question, because if you look at the 1970s, the stock market actually went down significantly by 50% in nominal terms from 72 to 74. Most people think that if we get inflation like we had in the 1970s, well, then that's good for the stock market.
Right.
But not necessarily. It can be.
Only
It may or may
Zimbabwe.
not be. I'm sorry?
Only in Zimbabwe, the stock market goes up when inflation is thousands of percent.
Yeah, that's where you get hyperinflation. That's definitely true for that. But when you get this 8 or 10% inflation, the stock market doesn't necessarily have to go up. And I know that's what most people's concern. And I think what you really need to think through when you look at real estate, or if you look at the stock market, the S&P 500, is you have to ask yourself, what's going to happen in nominal terms and what's going to happen in real terms. So a lot of people always ask me, George, is housing going up or down over the next 3 or 5 years?
Right.
Is housing going to crash? And I always say, well, crash in nominal terms or crash in real terms, because those are two completely different questions. I believe that at some point in the next 10 years, we're going to have to go back down to that historic trend line that we hit in 2012, because that takes us all the way back to 1900, and housing really adjusts with incomes, and incomes have to do with inflation. So
gravity does work once in a while. You can't just fly high.
Correct. Yeah, to your point, the trees don't grow to the sky indefinitely. So it's going to have to come down. But the question becomes, does it come down in nominal terms or real terms? Because if we get, let's say, a 5% appreciation in the real estate market over the next 10 years, but we get 10% consumer price inflation, I don't have a compound interest calculator in front of me,
Yeah.
but my guess, right at the top of my head, is within 6-7 years or so, at a 5% delta compounded, we're going to be down 60% in real terms. That will take us back to that historic trend line.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think we live on credit, we live on borrowed funds, we live on the strength of the dollar. The dollar is a reserve currency of the world. We get a free ride because the rest of the world is using dollars every day. And most of us take it for granted, right? We keep milking that cow thinking that nothing's going to happen. Well, something bad is going to happen. George, this has been amazing. Thank you for spending an hour with us. I'm sure our community is going to love this, and we'd love to have you back and revisit some of those predictions and see if we hit it or if we miss a few of them. But thanks for spending your time with us.